What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week 2 running back start sits. If you guys are new to the channel, I'm going to go through every single week 2 matchup, so all 16 games. I'm going to talk about every single fantasy relevant running back, and I'm going to list them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the running backs you feel very confident throwing into your RB1 or your RB2 spot. Typically, we're looking for around 24 running backs in this area. The fringe options, these are maybe the players you don't feel great as your running back 1 or 2, but they're fine, slotting into the RB3 spot. The flex spot, if you're desperate for an RB2, they are definitely playable. And then sits would be guys I'd prefer to keep on my bench. If you enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night game. A great divisional matchup here between the Bills and the Dolphins. And starting off with the Bills, I feel like this is kind of what we expected out of their running back room. We saw James Cook take most of the running back opportunities. You're obviously still going to have Josh Allen kind of vulturing near the goal line. But I think James Cook is still a very strong start. He's going to be like in that fringe RB1 territory. So definitely a solid play. We saw Ray Davis have a nice run. He had a nice reception, definitely kind of working his way into this backfield. But at this point, he's definitely nothing more than a handcuff. So he's definitely going to be a sit. Now, looking at this Dolphins backfield, I'm not victory lapping. It's only week 1, but I was very, very in on Devon Achane. And after week 1, I'm feeling pretty great about that call. He led the team with 10 carries. Nothing crazy, but this was like a rare Dolphins game where they were very inefficient on the ground. Only went for 24 yards on those carries, but he was very involved as a pass catcher, was second on the team in targets with 7, caught all 7 of those targets for 76 receiving yards. Also, another great sign for Devon Achane was that he took both of the goal line snaps. This is something that I was hearing all offseason. Raheem Mostert's the running back 1. He's going to lead this backfield. Achane's not getting goal line work. His workload's not large enough. What do we see in week 1? Super involved as a pass catcher. He was getting that work on the goal line, which led to him getting into the end zone. So at this point, he's pretty much operating as like their number 1 running back and also operating as their wide receiver 3. Like, he was ultra involved as a pass catcher. That's kind of the area of growth that I was expecting here in year 2. But I think to see it, at such an extreme in week 1 is definitely a great sign. This was not a great start here for Raheem Mostert. He is clearly behind Devon Achane in terms of his usage, and it also seems like he is at risk of losing work to Jeff Wilson and or Jalen Wright. It does seem like Mostert's a little bit banged up. I think he left like early in the 4th quarter. Then we saw Jeff Wilson get a drive, kind of get some snaps in there. But if he's already injured, he's getting up there in age. You have Jalen Wright, who is a healthy scratch, but could start to emerge in this backfield. If Raheem Mostert's like already banged up and he's not getting the goal line work, it is pretty concerning. Not a super easy matchup here against the Bills, so I have Raheem Mostert as a sit. If we get some sort of great injury news, then I might change this, but right now, if I had Raheem Mostert, I would not feel super great about playing him here heading into week 2. Now, shifting over to the Sunday slate, we have the Raiders taking on the Ravens, and I don't really like either of these Raiders running backs in this matchup. This is a pretty horrible matchup here against the Ravens. Also a pretty rough game script, most likely for Zamir White, where the Ravens are 9.5-point favorites. They're likely going to be leading early on. This is probably not going to be a game where the Raiders are going to be able to just, pound the ball a million times, really establish the run. And we already saw that in week 1, Zamir White was outsnapped by Alexander Mattison. He only had a 25% route participation. At this point, Zamir White's weekly floor is very, very low because he's pretty much all rushing production. He has very limited receiving upside. And if you're all rushing, you're also very touchdown dependent, and on a bad offense that could easily get behind in games, that's kind of a recipe for disaster here at the running back position. So he can pretty much be phased completely out of games. I would not be shocked if this was like a better matchup here for Alexander Mattison, where they're trailing, they need that pass catching back. So at this point, I wouldn't like playing either of these running backs. I'm actually going to be listing both of them as sits. And that definitely is a tough hit for Zamir White because he was drafted as if he could be like your locked in running back 2 every single week. And after what we saw in week 1, I'm not super confident that that's the case. And then for the Ravens here, I know some people are kind of worried about Derrick Henry. He was outsnapped by Justice Hill in week 1. And I'm someone who is not high on Derrick Henry, but I'm not freaking out. That's a rare game script where the Ravens are actually going to be down. They're going to be favored and winning the majority of their games moving forward. Now, I don't think Derrick Henry should have been drafted as like a mid to high end round 2 pick. I don't think he's going to have the workload to support that. but I still think he's going to be a nice option. He's going to have touchdown upside. He's going to be efficient behind this offensive line with the threat of Lamar's legs. So I still think he's a really solid start, and I wouldn't be full-blown panicking after kind of, a lackluster week one. And then for Justice Hill, even though he was kind of interesting in week one, like I talked about with Derrick Henry, I don't think the game script is going to be favoring Justice Hill moving forward, especially in this specific matchup here against the Raiders. Moving over to the Chargers-Panthers game, this was honestly great to see out of J.K. Dobbins. It seemed like heading into week one, we had like this 50-50 split between Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. We kind of wanted to see who emerged out of those two. And opportunity-wise, it was a pretty close split. 13 opportunities for Dobbins, 12 for Edwards. But J.K. Dobbins definitely looked like the much better option, and I would expect him to be, the more clear running back one moving forward. He had 10 carries for 135 yards and a touchdown, compared to Gus Edwards' 11 carries for 26 yards. Dobbins was also just way more involved as a pass catcher. Wasn't necessarily bringing in a million targets, but he had a 59% route participation, which is pretty significant for two running backs that were pretty close in terms of their overall snap number. This is a great matchup here going up against the Panthers. We just saw them get absolutely shredded by the Saints, and I don't think the Saints have some sort of like elite, rushing attack. So I think these running backs can feast. I like J.K. Dobbins, and I could see the argument for Gus Edwards being playable. Like, if you're desperate, I would not be shocked if both these guys had decent games. But if he's just completely a non-factor in the receiving game, and he's also splitting carries, you're really banking on a touchdown, and I don't like that in like my running back 2 spot or even the flex. I prefer if you had someone else, but if you're super desperate, maybe you went hero RB, zero RB. This is a decent matchup here for Gus Edwards. Then on the other side here for the Panthers, this backfield is looking pretty unplayable. We saw Chuba Hubbard take 2 out of pretty much every 3 drives. So he played the first 2, then Sanders would come in, then he'd play the next 2, then Sanders would take the one after that. But he ended with 6 carries to Miles Sanders' 5. Sanders also had the only 1 running back target. This Panthers offense just looks terrible after week 1, and I just think it's too rough of an offense to really tolerate like a split here. Like, Chuba getting 66 of this terrible offense in terms of the backfield is not cutting it for me. So he's going to be a sit along with Miles Sanders. I do think when Jonathan Brooks is back, he's someone who can be involved as a pass catcher, will still be fantasy relevant. But after week 1, it's not looking great here for these Panthers weapons. Moving over to the Saints-Cowboys matchup. For the Saints, you have them just coming off a dominant win over the Panthers, who we just talked about. Alvin Kamara with a nice game. Looks like he's going to be pretty close to their workhorse. Fire him up as a really strong start. We did see Jamal Williams get into the end zone, but very late in the game. Don't think, he's playable in this matchup. And then for the Cowboys, this was definitely one of the backfields I was kind of more interested in looking at here, looking at the split between Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle. And we saw that in week 1, it was a pretty even split. Zeke played 38 snaps, Dowdle played 28. Zeke ran 12 routes, Dowdle ran 11. Zeke had 12 opportunities, Dowdle had 9. So pretty close to 50-50 there. Really the one kind of like differentiating factor was that Zeke saw the 1 goal line carry, so he got into the end zone, which obviously led to a better fantasy day. I don't think this is like a set in stone split. I think Zeke could potentially pull away. I think Dowdle could potentially pull away. Both guys are interesting. It's a backfield I will continue to monitor, but I think with Zeke getting that goal line carry, he's definitely the more playable option. So I'm going to list him as a fringe option, and then Rico Dowdle is going to be a sit. Moving over to the Buccaneers taking on the Lions. For the Buccaneers, Rachaad White once again handling a very strong workload. We did see Bucky Irving get in. He had some nice plays, was efficient with his opportunities. I do think throughout the season, Bucky Irving can continue to kind of work his way into this offense. But early on, I still think this is going to be Rachaad White's backfield, and he's going to be a very solid start. And then Bucky Irving is going to be a sit. Then for the Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery. Both guys produced in Sunday Night Football. Jahmyr Gibbs going to have more of that receiving upside, the big playability. David Montgomery going to have that solid workload on the ground. More often than not, he's going to be, their red zone back, their hammer near the goal line. We saw him pretty much just win it for them with that final drive in overtime. So both these dudes, solid starts. I think David Montgomery, more of like a running back 2. Jahmyr Gibbs, solid running back 1 play. In the next matchup, we have the Colts taking on the Packers. This one's not too complicated. For the Colts, Jonathan Taylor, as expected, was the workhorse. Fire him up as a strong start, running back 1. And then for the Packers, I do think Josh Jacobs takes a hit with the Jordan Love injury, but it doesn't seem like he's going to miss a ton of time. still handled a solid workload, so he's going to be a locked-in start, sitting Marshawn Lloyd and Emmanuel Wilson. Then we're going to have the Browns taking on the Jaguars, and Jerome Ford is actually someone who I talked about as a sell-high candidate. I do think if I had him on my roster, I would be looking to move him, but I also think he's a decent start here in week 2. In the short term, I think he's a nice play. Had a 75% snap share in week 1, 66% route participation. He took 12 of the 14 running back carries, was targeted 7 times. So a pretty solid overall workload until Nick Chubb is back. I do think he's going to be their clear running back 1. So I think here going up against the Jaguars, he's more of like a back-end RB2 play. Maybe when I go through my final rankings, he'll be like a high-end running back 3, but I do think he's playable as a running back 2. I will say I'm a little bit worried because this Jaguars defense actually did a pretty great job kind of slowing down the Dolphins run game, which was just insanely explosive last year with Achane, Mostert. Pretty much all those dudes were held in check. I think Achane was like 10 carries for 24 yards. I think Mostert was like 6 for 9. So they did lock in against the Dolphins, but I still think like we saw in week 1, Jerome Ford is going to get those dump offs from Deshaun Watson. So even if he's not super efficient as a runner, he's going to have the touchdown upside. And then he also is going to be involved as a pass catcher. On the other side here for the Jaguars, Tank Bigsby kind of surprisingly matched Travis Etienne's 12 carries. Last year, we saw Etienne was just the clear workhorse. I don't think it was crazy to expect that Bigsby would be more involved, but I think, splitting carries 50-50 was pretty surprising. Bigsby was also the more efficient option. I do think Bigsby got some more work because we saw Etienne fumble inside the 5. He lost the ball, was looking like a touchdown, ended up being a turnover. So I do think they shifted over to Bigsby a little bit, kind of got put in the doghouse, I think more in the second half. But I still think Etienne's a solid play. I'm not panicking. You fire him up as a solid start. He had a 68% route participation. He took the goal line snap. He took 7 of the 8 third downs. He took every 2-minute drill snap. Pretty much all the valuable touches Travis Etienne is still getting. So fire him up as a strong play. But I do think Tank Bigsby is someone you keep an eye on. But in this specific matchup, he will be a sit. Looking at the 49ers taking on the Vikings, starting off here with the 49ers, up until a few hours before kickoff, it looked like CMC was going to be good to go. Seemed like he was trending towards playing. Then we obviously get the news that he is inactive. Jordan Mason steps up, and Jordan Mason goes in and pretty much dominates. So if CMC misses week 2, which it seems like, is kind of up in the air at this point, could be possible that he's out week 2 also. I think Jordan Mason is a really strong start. If CMC's active, playing, they obviously feel good enough about him, and he's obviously locked into your fantasy lineup. So it's a tough break early on if you do have CMC. If he's active week 2, you're obviously starting him. But if CMC's out, I'd feel pretty confident firing up Jordan Mason into my lineup. What he did against a very tough Jets defense was very impressive. So you got to feel good about him if you did roster him as like a handcuff option. Definitely one of the more valuable handcuffs. And then for the Vikings, Aaron Jones with a really solid debut here. 14 carries, 94 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown. Also caught 2 passes for 15 yards. I think his usage was encouraging. I think it was also encouraging that this Vikings offense just looked competent, right? If this is even an average unit, I think Aaron Jones is definitely going to pay off as a solid running back too. So not a good matchup here, but I still think he's playable as a nice RB2 option. Moving over to the Seahawks-Patriots game. For the Seahawks, Kenneth Walker really dominated the usage. Zach Charbonnet still had some involvement, a few carries here and there, involved as a pass catcher, but this is very clearly Kenneth Walker's backfield. You fire him up as a solid start, sit Zach Charbonnet. And then for the Patriots, a monster game out of Ramondre Stevenson. I don't think that's something we're going to be getting consistently here out of Ramondre. I'm not overly high on this Patriots offense moving forward, but it was great to see him ball out. It was great to see him have a solid overall workload. Hopefully that carries into week 2 here, but I think he's a nice option as like an RB2 play. Then we're going to have the Jets taking on the Titans. And for the Jets here, obviously no brainer. Breece Hall, fire him up as a high-end running back 1, a start in your lineup, sitting his likely handcuff, Braylon Allen. And then for the Titans here, I have Tony Pollard as a fringe option, and I would definitely consider him as a start if it wasn't a bad matchup here against the Jets. I do just think this Titans offense as a whole, Will Levis looked rough against, a tougher secondary. I do think this Titans offense could just be completely shut down. But we were kind of hearing throughout, preseason, training camp, that this was going to be a 1A, 1B situation, a 50-50 split. That is not what we got. This was Tony Pollard's backfield. He took 16 of the 20 running back carries. He saw 4 of the 8 running back targets. And I will say, both running backs looked good. Pollard was good. He was efficient. So was Tajay Spears. But I do think Pollard played well enough where if they want him to lead this backfield, he did enough, to kind of maintain his usage. Like I said, a bad matchup here in week 2. So I think he's more of like a high-end running back 3, but definitely someone where if you drafted him as like a back-end running back 3 option, you should feel pretty good about him moving forward. And then sitting Tajay Spears just did not have a large enough workload in week 1 to justify playing him. Moving over to a divisional matchup between the Giants and the Commanders. For the Giants here, I think Devin Singletary is a start as like a back-end RB2. He dominated the running back usage, 10 of the 14 carries. He saw 5 targets. This is a nice matchup here against the Commanders. 2 teams that kind of struggled in week 1. I think these offenses are going to fare a little bit better going up against these opposing defenses. So I think he's a nice play as like a back-end RB2 option. And then for the Commanders here, I was someone who was pretty in on Brian Robinson. I was pretty out on Austin Eckler. After seeing the usage from week 1, even in a game where they were trailing, I'm feeling pretty good about that call. This is B-Rob's backfield. He took 13 of the 15 running back carries. Both these guys saw 4 targets. Eckler actually was their leading receiver, which is a little bit sad, for Terry McLaurin here, but I just don't think Eckler is going to have enough consistent usage, to be a fantasy relevant option. Like maybe he has some big receiving games, but if you're getting 2 carries, even in a game script that should kind of favor you, that is not ideal. For Brian Robinson, I do think this is a favorable game script for him, a game they're favored in. So he is going to be a start for me as like a back-end RB2 option, someone who definitely benefits from the matchup. Then we're going to have the Rams taking on the Cardinals. And for the Rams here, I think if you drafted Kyren Williams, you should be feeling pretty good with what you saw in week 1. I know there was some concern about, him returning punts, Blake Corum potentially working his way into this offense. And I'll be totally honest, like those reports, they got to me a little bit. I moved him down in my rankings, and I still don't really regret that decision. But if you did draft him, his usage was dominant in week 1. I will say, though, I don't think you're completely out of the woods. Sean McVay, he can be a little bit bipolar with his running back usage. Like we thought Cam Akers was in the clear. All of a sudden, here comes Kyren Williams. So I wouldn't feel overly confident moving forward, but I do think like we could mark up week 1 as a win just in terms of the usage. Just hope he logs some efficient games. I know the offensive line had some concerns, but to hold off Blake Corum, I do think he'll need to start producing here. But I still think heading into week 2, a very, very strong start as a running back 1. Sitting Blake Corum, who I don't even know if he played an offensive snap for them, so was completely out of the picture in week 1. Still someone who I'd roster, though, as like a nice handcuff with some upside later on in the season. And then for the Cardinals here, this was pretty clearly James Conner's backfield. You fire him up as a solid like running back 2, maybe even RB1 moving forward. I think Trey Benson got like a drive in there. Amari DiMercato was operating, some also, but definitely going to be sitting those 2 and starting James Conner. Then we're going to have the Steelers taking on the Broncos. And I guess kind of unsurprisingly from Arthur Smith, we got some very odd running back usage. Najee came out and pretty much dominated the carries. He took 20 of the 26 running back carries. Jaylen Warren, who was pretty much in like a 50-50 split last year with Najee, and by the way, is a very, very good running back, arguably better than Najee Harris. Jaylen Warren only saw 2 carries and 2 targets. Now, is this an example of Arthur Smith just being Arthur Smith? Is this because of Jaylen Warren's like preseason injury, where maybe they're trying to like ease him back into, the fold here? I'm not sure. It's tough to know what to expect in week 2. I definitely don't feel confident enough to, consider starting Jaylen Warren here, but I also don't think Najee Harris is like a locked-in start. Like if he fell back to a 50% carry split, I would not be shocked. So he's going to be a fringe option for me, Najee Harris. Sitting Jaylen Warren and Cordarrelle Patterson, who all of a sudden has a role, which is a different issue I don't even want to dive into. Then looking at the Broncos here, this was kind of gross. Javonte led in snaps and routes, but Jaleel McLaughlin led with 9 carries and 6 targets. So I do think a bigger role than expected for Jaleel McLaughlin, but he really didn't do a ton with it. I do think Audric Estime is interesting. I didn't talk about him as a waiver wire pickup. I probably should have, but if Javonte and Jaleel McLaughlin continue to struggle, I would not be shocked if Audric Estime continued to kind of expand on his role here. Rookie, more unproven option, but I do think Sean Payton likes him and could be someone who is, fantasy relevant moving forward. We're going to have the Bengals taking on the Chiefs, and this Bengals running back usage was interesting. I think at this point, Zach Moss is the clear leader in that backfield. He took 33 snaps to 17 for Chase Brown. Zach Moss also ran more routes. He took 9 of the 12 running back carries. He out-targeted Chase Brown 4-3. And if I'm being honest, as someone who was fairly in on Chase Brown, this was pretty much like worst case scenario for him. We knew he was going to have some involvement, like he was going to play. If like worst case scenario, he would be the running back 2. But my kind of assumption heading into the year was that Zach Moss was going to be the goal line guy, the short yardage situations. Chase Brown was going to be more of like the 2-minute drill, third down back, the receiving option. We saw Zach Moss take the goal line snaps, he took the 2-minute drill work, and he dominated third downs. So he took all the important touches for the running back position. Chase Brown is pretty much like scrapping for early down work, which is awful. He's definitely still rosterable, like worst case as a handcuff. This backfield could evolve throughout the season, but at this point, Zach Moss is going to be a fringe play for me. Chase Brown is going to be a sit. Then for the Chiefs here, Isaiah Pacheco, I think strong, like back-end running back 1 play. Fire him up as a strong start. Sitting Samaje Perine, who did play, but didn't have a massive role in week 1. They're going to have the Bears taking on the Texans. And for the Bears here, I have DeAndre Swift as a fringe option. He had decent usage in week 1, 69% snap share, 60% route participation. He took 11 of the 16 running back carries. He was only targeted 1 time. And I just don't think this Bears offense looked good enough for me to confidently play DeAndre Swift. Like maybe they turn it around here in week 2. Caleb plays way better. The offensive line plays way better, but I'm going to have to see it first before I confidently fire up DeAndre Swift. If he's like your running back 2, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. But here for week 2, I'd prefer him as like a fringe option, an RB3 play. And then sitting Khalil Herbert, who really did not have much of a role. And then for Joe Mixon here, I mean, just a dominant performance out of Joe Mixon. If he can stay healthy, retain that usage, he is going to be an absolute monster for fantasy. Looking at the Falcons Eagles matchup here, believe this is Monday Night Football, final game of the week. We have the Falcons taking on the Eagles. And for the Falcons here, Bijan Robinson, we were hearing some rumblings from like beat reporters that this was going to be like a close split. Personally, never bought that. Glad I did not, because Bijan Robinson dominated the snaps. He's a high-end running back 1 moving forward. And then for the Eagles, Saquon Barkley, workhorse usage, scored 3 touchdowns. I was worried about the touchdown upside. That was clearly not a concern in week 1. So you fire him up as a very strong running back 1 play. So that's going to wrap it up for all 16 week 2 running back matchups. Let me know your thoughts. If you have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. If you enjoyed, hit that like button. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.